Good evening, and welcome to the Past, Present, and Future of Striped Bass, a Chesapeake Perspective. My name is David Sikorsky, and I'm the Executive Director of Coastal Conservation Association Maryland, or CCA Maryland. We at CCA are proud to have partnered with sport fishing and boating friends, and have Lenny Rudow from FishTalk magazine here tonight to host a great conversation about what happened nearly 40 years ago, when Maryland shut down the striped bass fishery for 5 years. Of course, there were a lot of things leading up to that period, and a lot has happened since. But tonight we have three great experts who are in the trenches and have done so much important work for this iconic game fish species. In our future episodes in July and September, we'll be talking about the present situation, and then our vision for the future of the Chesapeake Bay and what sport fishing and boating may look like. So thank you for joining us tonight. And Lenny, I'm going to pass it on to you to get this conversation started.
Thanks, Dave, and hey there, people. I'm Lenny Rudow, Angler-in-Chief at FishTalk magazine, and more importantly for tonight, a lifelong Chesapeake Bay angler. Now, before we get started, we do want to thank our partners for helping us to make all of this possible. Yamaha, Wrightwaters, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation, the American Sport Fishing Association, the Sportsman's the Sportsman's Congressional Foundation, Coastal Conservation Association, Boat US, and the Marine Trades Association of Maryland. These are organizations and companies that have stepped up to help support our recreational angling community here on the Chesapeake. They deserve a thank you. And more importantly, I want to thank you folks, each and every one of you, not only for being a part of the recreational fishing community, but also for taking your time here and now to tune in and become a more involved, better educated angler. Now, we've seen some of our recreational fishing opportunities dwindle in recent years. And the only way we can turn that around is to speak as a community from a sensible, intelligent, educated viewpoint. We hope that series will help with that. Now, we do have a couple very basic ground rules we want to set out. We want to make sure that everything goes smoothly tonight. So please put your questions into the comments section. We want to know what you want to know. Now, let's try and focus on questions on the moratorium and the relevant time period. We will address the future of the fishery later on in the series. Please be patient. It may take us a few minutes to cull through the questions and get them to the panel. And of course, please remain polite and civil. Hey, we're all on the same team here, people. We all want healthy rockfish populations, and we all want more opportunities to go fishing for them. So, Zach, can we put up that graphic that shows how the process that leads us to the rules we end up with? Thank you. So this is really simple. We're boiling this down quite a bit here, people. Congress makes laws. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, ASMFC, which I'm sure you all have heard of, that then operates under those laws. It ranges from North Carolina to Maine. Every state has a seat on the board on the commission. And each state gets one vote. There are also some other voters like the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They come up with, they take science into account. They take all the different fish counts into account. And they come up with things like the total harvest limits. How many fish can we take out of the water? Then they send those limits to the state. The state then decides the recreational and commercial regulations that are necessary to make those goals. So, there are a lot of people involved. It's not a simple process. It's impossible for the managers to make everyone happy all the time. That's just a given. But when we as an angling community can communicate with these folks in a responsible way, with well-educated viewpoints, for the most part, they do listen to what we have to say. And the last ASMFC meeting was a phenomenal example of this. There was overwhelming public comment. It was intelligently made. And it really drove the conversation. It really directed the path that the ASMFC chose to go down. So it really is important. It really is important that we speak from an educated and responsible viewpoint. Now, tonight we're going to start with what was, for my generation, the first really epic event in striped bass fisheries management. And that was, of course, the moratorium. To help us understand exactly what happened, how we got there, we have a panel of three participants together with over a century of experience in science, conservation, and management. They were on the front lines when the moratorium hit. And Each one brings a unique perspective that they can share with us. First up, I want to introduce Bill Goldsborough. Now, Bill spent a 37-year career with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. He's been a tireless advocate for the Bay. He served for over a decade for the ASMFC, and he's an avid angler. Bill retired, now he lives in Florida. Well, Bill, thanks for all your hard work, and we'll forgive you for moving to Florida, but I just got to say, their crabs, no contest. I mean, come on. It isn't even close. But thanks for being with us.
Hey, no problem, Lenny. And I don't mind wearing flip-flops year-round, so take that.
Right.
I will tell you, though, I do miss striped bass. And anglers of a certain age will remember that the heyday for that, actually, in Maryland, the Maryland waters of the Bay, was the 60s. We caught a lot of striped bass in the 60s, and that's what I grew up doing. And those who are really focusing will remember also that 1970 was a big year for striper reproduction. So it was really peak times. But after that, it dropped way off. The 70s were terrible for striper reproduction. Numbers went way down. Anglers switched to bluefish, but the commercial fishery kept going. Of course, they're more efficient. They're using more efficient gear. And they were harvesting stripers when they're concentrated, either in the deep water in the winter or the spawning grounds in the spring. And the stock just kept going down through the 70s. Everybody started getting worried about that. I was among them. And there were a lot of arguments over what was causing it. Of course, the watermen thought it was pollution, not overfishing. And to their credit, they've actually been a big advocate for pollution for many decades. But, Congress wasn't satisfied. Anglers all thought overfishing was a problem. So Congress stepped in and funded a big study that went on for a long time looking at the problem. And the inescapable conclusion was that it was overfishing in the 70s that drove the stocks down. That actually was a momentous conclusion. Believe it or not, it was the first time we actually had documentation that you could overfish a coastal fishery. And from there on, everything changed.
Well, I tell you, what grabs me the most about what you just said is Congress funded. Boy, do I wish we could get Congress funding for more scientific studies these days. And speaking of science, let's bring in Jim Uphoff. Jim is also a native of Maryland. Jim started with the DNR nearly 50 years ago as a summer assistant. He's worked full-time for the DNR for nearly 44 years, and I'm told he has sampled and analyzed everything that swims in the bay and some things that don't. Now, he spent much of his early career working on rockfish and is currently the Fish Habitat and Ecosystems Assessment Program Chief for the DNR's Fishing and Boating Service. Welcome, Jim.
Well, thanks, Lenny, and thanks for inviting me. I guess I'll let you get on with your next introduction. I think you have questions.
I'll ask you plenty of questions. Well, but yeah, let's bring in Marty. We also have with us tonight Marty Gary. Now, he's a bit younger than our other guests, but he brings a different perspective since he began working for the DNR just as a moratorium was implemented in 1985. You want to talk about getting thrown into the fire? Well, there you go. Since 2013, Marty's been the executive director of the Potomac River's Fisheries Commission and currently is chairman of the Atlantic Striped Bass Board for the ASMFC. Welcome, Marty.
I had to unmute myself. Thank you, Lenny, so much for allowing me to be a part of this conversation tonight. And just want to say to your audience, because I know there's going to be a lot of questions, I think this is a special opportunity for all that are listening in tonight. I'll shower my colleagues with some extra praise. Bill Goldsborough is one of the foremost respected fishery scientists in the Chesapeake Bay region of all time. He's one of just a handful of David H. Hart award winners at ASMFC. There's only a few that get that level of recognition. And so you have a huge amount of institutional and experiential knowledge with Jim. I'm with Bill, and then Jim is he's a person maybe that not everybody, all of your listeners know too much about, but Jim has been around, as you noted, for a long, long time. And among our community of fishery scientists and biologists in the Chesapeake, he is really one of the greatest mentors that we turn to. I try to reach out to Jim often to get his advice. He's seen it all. So between Jim and Bill, your viewers tonight have a tremendous opportunity to look back in time to see how things were, what we learned from that time, the mistakes, the lessons, etc. I was a young fisheries biologist that came on, as you noted, in '85, so I have a little bit different perspective, but I'm honored to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you very much, Marty. And Jim, let's bounce it right to you from there. So first, do you have any disclaimers you would like to provide?
A very quick disclaimer that what I say tonight isn't like an official view from DNR. I don't have to say that. It's out of respect for the folks I work for. Their jobs are hard enough. So what I say is not necessarily policy, but
Fair
it is
enough.
experience.
Fair enough. Well, let me ask you, let's harken back to what Bill was just talking about. And let me ask you about the scientific perspective, the fishery science perspective on the lead up to the moratorium. What were you seeing from a scientific perspective?
Well, I mean, we didn't have a lot of information to work from. We had, you're going to show this in a minute, a juvenile index, which is a measure of how many young fish are produced every year, and landings. But both of my bosses were extremely experienced with the fish and the fishery and had a very good sense of how things were going. We basically, as Bill said, we had about more than a decade of strong year classes that ended in 1970. And then things tapered off for a few years of modest year classes, and then mostly poor year classes, probably from the 80s, early 1980s to 1993. This year class trend wasn't unique to striped bass. Other species went through this as well, and not all of them were as sensitive to fishing as striped bass. So in our view, there was something going on in the larval nursery. In the meantime, the fishery had geared up to high abundance, and management couldn't reduce fishing pressure to bring things in line with recruitment. And based on an egg index that goes back to 55, the recruitment egg production held up for almost 10 years while recruitment was failing. And then that failed too. And we were in a true overfishing situation by the early 80s.
So to boil it all down to the very basics, from a scientific standpoint, what you were seeing was poor reproduction coupled with heavy fishing. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. We had the regulations we had in place were totally inadequate. The professionals at DNR did attempt to get stronger measures in place, but it didn't take.
Okay. Now, Marty, let me bounce this back at you with a slightly different take, because you were the new guy, right? You were the youngster in the room when all this was going on, but certainly you had coworkers, mentors, folks at the DNR you were dealing with on a regular basis. Were you hearing the same kind of stuff that we're hearing from Bill and Jim right now?
Yeah, thanks, Lenny. So I had a different perspective than Bill and Jim. And Bill was involved with a lot of the policy through his organization, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, involved with a lot of the advisory groups that interacted strongly with the leadership at DNR. I'll let him, talk to those points. Jim, on the other hand, was a senior biologist. He was a biologist that myself and the younger folks looked up to for guidance. He was one of our mentors, still is one of our mentors, and always will be. My perspective that I'd share with you is, having just finished my studies at Texas A&M University, I got a short-term contract, which turned into a long-term contract, and wound up staying at DNR for a long time. But there in the first couple of years, just as a moratorium is launching, I'm thinking to myself, if we restore this fishery in the course of my career, it might be a great achievement. In talking to some of the other biologists, folks like Jim, things were not great. The one thing we share in common is, and I think we can say this definitively, we know what bad looks like. We lived it, we experienced it. And I'm sure there's a fair number of the viewers you have on that might go back that far too.
Oh,
And you can read about it. Yeah, you can read about it all you want, but it's one of those things until you experience it. But anyway, hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, believe me, I remember when I was a kid, like you went fishing for bluefish, and a rockfish was like this mythical beast that was evidently the state fish, even though you never saw one. I mean, that's kind of what it was like. Well, so everyone seems to be on the same page with fishing pressure and reproduction. Obviously, two, key issues that were occurring back then, and I think it's fair to say are occurring in one way or another today, right? As we see the decline today. So we can associate the two, but I want to ask you about a different factor. And I want to ask you about this in specific because we had a lot of folks commenting on it, even up until tonight, before we even got the ball rolling here. And that's Menhaden. Everybody, I'm sure, who's watching this right now is very familiar with the Menhaden issue. And we're going to be talking about forage in a future episode. I don't necessarily want to talk too much about that right now, but from a historical perspective, I wonder, how were the Menhaden populations back then? How did it compare? Were you guys worried about the bunker back then? Who wants to jump in on that?
They were, when I was doing the seining survey, we hated them. There were so many of them. It was unbelievable.
Wow.
They were in a period of high productivity. And they just swamped everything. Some days we were counting we would take a small bucket, count how many went into a small bucket, count how many small buckets went into a 5-gallon bucket, and then we counted 5-gallon buckets.
So it sounds fair to say there wasn't a big giant shortage of Menhaden.
No.
You're making me curious though, man. How long did that continue?
It continued into the mid-90s. Their high abundance is associated with something called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation.
Woo.
Yeah, I know. It's a weather phenomenon. It's not a cycle, but it's a pattern. And fish have a habit of responding sometimes to these long-term patterns. And in this case, it seems to be a trigger for Menhaden. It has to do with bringing in certain weather patterns, it increases the frequency of hurricanes and things like it. You really don't want to get into this, but
all right. Well, let's keep going. Then. But you've already taken us on. Let Bill chime in. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so Lenny, keep this in mind now. The 80s were a heyday for Menhaden, like Jim was saying, Menhaden production, but also the fishery was going gangbusters and catching hundreds of millions of tons of Menhaden, the reduction fishery, the industrial fishery. But keep in mind now, this was a low point for striped bass. So there wasn't as big of the demand for forage from striped bass as there was once we restored them. So it became a big issue. Forage base became a bigger issue for striped bass once we brought their numbers back in the 90s. And Menhaden numbers were going down. I won't claim that they were overfished in the 80s, but they fished them really hard. But for whatever reason, the multi-decadal oscillation Jim was talking about and other reasons, Menhaden numbers did go down in the 90s as striper numbers were going up. And there's an interaction there. So it became a bigger issue for stripers later on in the late 90s.
The same thing that Rudy's asking here, you can see the question pop up at the bottom of the screen, the blues, right? Were they feeding on the forage? The same thing pops into my head. We had a lot of bluefish back then, right?
Yeah. And big ones.
Yeah, and clearly there was no, I guess from the bluefish's perspective, there must not have been a tremendous lack of food. I'm not a scientist, but I do recall back then we didn't see fish feeding on bay anchovies the way we see today. We saw them feeding on bunker. That was like the main thing. So, all right, well, let's jump on to another topic then. Let's take a look at some quick numbers going back before the moratorium and forward through it. Zach, can you bring up that ASMFC biomass chart? Let's get that on the screen here. And I'm sure many folks will have seen this before. It just is a nope, wrong one. Keep going. The biomass. There we go. Thank you, Zach. I should have told everybody, by the way, Fish Talks, basically tech guru, Zach Dittmars, is behind the curtain pulling the strings here, just as he does on Live with Lenny. So he's the one keeping us rolling here. Here's the biomass numbers. We can see they were super duper low at points. They jumped up. We all know what happened there. We had, gosh, the best rock fishing that anybody can remember. But it shows how low the numbers were going into the moratorium, coming out of it. And you know, one of the interesting, really striking things about looking at this chart is that when the moratorium was lifted, the population was actually, it looks on this chart like it was a lot lower than it is today. So I want to get the perspective of a current fisheries manager, Gary. When you look at a chart like this, do you trust these numbers? Are they solid?
Well, I would tell you, Lenny, I know this is a discussion about the past, and so what you have in front of you is a chart that takes us from the past pretty close to the current time period. But I think our science has grown in leaps and bounds. There isn't a more data-rich species that we manage than striped bass. So your question is, do I trust the numbers? I do, but those numbers have improved as the data has improved over time. And this is an incredibly important graphic, the spawning stock biomass, because it'll be a discussion for your future panel. But we've set a really high bar based on 125% of 1995 SSB. And we never really hit that. If for folks that listened to the meeting last week when we approved Amendment 7, we've never really hit it. Some people will say we have, but there's been a recalibration of the MRIP, which used to be the MRF's estimates on recreational fishing mortality and catch estimates. And so as those get adjusted, so does the bar. So this is a really important graph. I do believe it's accurate, but it's gotten better over time as our understanding of the science has.
Well, that's really interesting. I want to bring Jim in on this then. When you look at particularly the moratorium years that are represented here, what's your feeling on how realistic those numbers are going back to the 80s and the 90s?
Generally, with this type of assessment, the further back you go, the estimates kind of really settle in. That seems fairly reasonable.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, but to make a point here, we are below the threshold, but at the level we're at now, we're extremely close to the same stock level that produced the huge 1993 year class that kicked off really this period of high production that you were talking about, you know, great fishing, followed by a series of them spaced out, but, you know, every few years. And so, yes, you know, you have to worry about things declining, but remember that level of stock size is capable of producing a lot of fish.
So that's an interesting point. Maybe we should bounce that to Bill and get Bill's take on how many rockfish do you need to have one of these tremendous year classes, or is it all just a function of weather, or do we even know?
Well, here's what I would say, Lenny. Looking at this graph, I would emphasize the low point that we started from before and during the moratorium and the recovery period. That steep incline that came from the management plan, the recovery plan that the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries put in place, that the states implemented. And it was a moratorium in Maryland and Delaware and Pennsylvania, and later on Virginia went on. But most states all the way up to Maine were still harvesting some bigger fish, but within the limit, really high minimum sizes consistent with that recovery plan. And what that did was that accumulated these older fish. So it rebuilt the spawning stock biomass from that really low level that we started with. So that's the essence of the success story we're talking about here. And what it told us was that whole experience told us that you can overfish, that it is important to maintain spawning stock biomass above some threshold level, even as you're also trying to maintain habitat and water quality. All these things are important. And yet, we see in recent years, we dropped below the threshold level that they did designate as part of the current management plan. So that's an issue that we've got to deal with. But understand by looking at this graph, how much higher it still is than the low point back during the moratorium. So we're not back down to that by any means. We just have to manage the fishery like we learned we need to. Fisheries management is an essential complement to habitat management, and that's how you maintain a vibrant fishery, which is what we all want.
So that's great points. One of you gentlemen, whoever wants to, can you tackle Brady's point? We may want to explain the significance of the threshold. What are we talking about here? Who wants it? Come on, Gary, you're in the middle of it. Why don't you grab this?
Jim, I'll defer to you because you're the quantitative one. I know from a management perspective, what it means for us, the threshold is a triggering of it's a management response per the fishery management plan. And we discussed a lot of that last week with adjustments to triggers and things like that. But Jim, you are the quantitative person that we all look up to if you want to take a crack at it.
Great, thanks. A threshold, basically, in something, it's kind of a term that comes from something called the precautionary approach, which is basically there was kind of a lot of overfishing going on all around the world. And in the 90s, they came up with this approach. The threshold is essentially a point for a population, in this case with spawning stock biomass, where you feel like there's a significant chance that something bad will happen. I'll leave it. That's the definition.
I love it. I love it because guess what all the anglers out there have been saying?
Well, in this case,
bad's happening.
The bad part of this is you don't have enough spawning stock to produce strong year classes, and that's what the fishery depends on.
Well, I guess the bright side to that point is the fact that we can at least have some faith that even with lower numbers, you guys have managed to manage the fishery properly to bring those numbers way the heck up there. Maybe I'm out of line, but it seems to me that the fishing in the 2000s probably was the best rockfish fishing, certainly in my lifetime. I mean, that's a guarantee.
I wouldn't want to do this again, but the rebuilding of this stock really depended on maximizing the survival of one average year class, which was 1982, plus the remnants of these big year classes in whatever was left in the 60s and 70s. I mean, we have both still a pretty decent spawning stock size, historically speaking, from this graph, and we have some good year classes in the bank still.
So that's a good that's a bright outlook. I like it.
Well, it all depends on what the environment wants to do to us, but we're not in the same situation that we were now that we were then. Not saying it's good, but it's not anything nearly as bad.
Gotcha. So let's look at the management standpoint of that. From a manager's standpoint, was the moratorium a home run hit? Was it a grand slam? Was it worth the pain?
Am I the manager? Or
anybody, any one of you guys, just jump on in. What do you think?
Oh, well, I'll comment on that. Understand that what was important here was having a recovery plan that all the states from North Carolina to Maine would implement. I think that's really the big lesson that came out of that period was that you need range-wide management. You need all anglers, all commercial fishermen throughout the range abiding by the same principles, the same goals under the rulemaking of the individual states. And that's what was accomplished by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And so we did that, and that was a huge success. And now we're at a point where we've got much better science than we had back then. It was really seat of the pants back then. But the moratorium itself was what one state did, and a couple other states joined in, like I said, Delaware, Pennsylvania. But all the states abided by that recovery plan, and that was really the key. Maryland's moratorium was declared unilaterally. Maryland didn't have to do it when they announced it in the fall of 1984. But Congress passed a bill a year later that did require all the states from Maine to North Carolina to implement plans of the ASMFC for striped bass. And those two things, Congress doing that, and Maryland's moratorium being the instigator, really, of a lot of that activity, were the things that were key to the recovery.
So we've got interstate management, right? We've got a much broader management scheme. And we've got, as Jim said, maintaining a certain level of the stock and having some good year classes. Other than those issues, are there any major differences that we saw in the years leading up to the moratorium, in the big population crash and the decline that we see today? Any big differences there?
It's like Bill said, the big difference is a greatly strengthened management system.
Well, one other pops into my mind, and I'll hit you guys with this. You guys can respond. What about changes in the way we fish? Right? Recreational fishing has changed quite a bit. I'm sure commercial fishing has changed quite a bit, and we haven't even touched on this topic of commercial yet. But there've got to be differences from then and now, just in the way that we recreational anglers fish. Doesn't strike you guys, huh?
There's no question. I just don't want to answer all the questions. I don't think it's fair. I keep hoping Marty or somebody will jump in ahead of me.
Well, I'll comment on that, Lenny. I mean, you make a really good point. The efficiency of harvest, whether it's recreational or commercial, is an important factor. A lot of times, fishing effort is an important data point, an important data that they collect to understand, how much fishing there is that goes into the models and so forth. But if the efficiency of that harvest increases or changes in some way, the effort data is altered. And so it's an important thing to keep track of. You may have to wait. The fishing rod hours, for example, is a measure of recreational fishing effort. You may have to weight that different if there's some new form of recreational fishing with that rod and reel that makes it more efficient.
There's so much controversy today over, who's fishing the right way, who's fishing good, who's fishing bad. Honestly, it's a difficult topic. But we got a question here that I want one of you guys to tackle, because Mark is asking, does biomass account for age structure? And this gets into the whole question over, how much cost is there to the fishery when we take a 50-inch fish versus how much cost is there to the fishery when we take 50 10-inch fish?
Pretty standard to biomass does not, total spawning stock biomass does not take into account the size of fish, but the assessment that is done is what's called an age structured assessment. So that the data that comes out of it and the management can take into account the size of fish. But in general, for fish ecology, the big fish are reproductively and proportionally more valuable than small fish. Yeah, it's, so The management, the idea with having low fishing mortality rates is that you build an extended age structure. You have big fish that spawn early, and then you'll build into the smaller females that spawn later. Hopefully, build some kind of buffering for when things go bad. Striped bass, unfortunately, their reproductive strategy is a gambler's bet. They put a lot of eggs into environmental situations that are very risky. The payoff is, it's probably not as bad as Bitcoin, but it's like the stock market. The payoff can be really big, but you can also lose your ass. And, for them, remember, all those eggs they produce over their lifetime that a female produces, the idea is basically to have 2 of them survive to adults, and you replace yourself. So
All right, well, that's a very interesting perspective. Zach, let's bring up the Young of the Year graphic, because we didn't get much of a look at that during our 5-second glimpse earlier in the evening. And with all this talk about eggs, I think it's important to look at the structure here. And you can see, again, during the moratorium and leading up to the moratorium, we had some very low years of reproduction. Someone mentioned 1 year class. Was that the 82-year class that it was so important to sustain?
Yes.
Okay, so we can see that's not even an average year class. That's below average.
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Bill.
well, yeah, Lenny, at the time, that was an average year class. If you look at all the big ones we've had the last couple of decades, they brought the average up. But an 8 of the index, and the value of 8 was the long-term average at that time. And so really the 82-year class, I think was an 8.4, was basically average. But one thing I would point out on that here is look at the 78-year class. That was essentially identical to 82. And the commercial fishery fished on them as soon as they reached 12 inches, which would have been in like 1980. And what happened was the adult surveys the biologists were doing saw that blip of the 78-year class for those 2 years, and then it went away. We caught them up. And so when the 82-year class came along at the same value, that's what gave rise to the concept that, wow, we better protect these. These may be our last shot to really inject some fish into those older ages. We need to protect them until they get to spawning age. That's where that all came from, because we realized from that experience that, wow, we have a lot of fishing power here. We really can catch all these fish if we're not careful.
Interesting. That's fascinating. I never had heard before that line moves with that average.
Yeah,
we've got Dan. Is that Dan? I think that says Dan. Chiming in here and asking at what age and size do the females start spawning?
That's a Jim question, I believe, again.
Okay. It's depend answer. When striped bass are heavily fished, they can, in the past, they have matured. A lot of them have matured as 4-year-olds. When the stock really built up to a very high level and there was a lot of fish and a lot of competition, our gillnet survey wouldn't find females on the spawning grounds until they were almost 7 years old. And now it's dropped some as probably down into around 5-year-old, 6-year-old range, somewhere around in there. So it's very flexible depending on how high or low the population is. It's a response. This is very common in animal populations. Again, if things are low, they go into or fish populations, a high reproductive mode. And so that age at maturity can vary depending on how big the stock is, how well it's fed, and so on.
Boy, that's fascinating. That's something I never heard before, that's for sure. But, one of the things that we just talked about that leads into this is the fact that I think Bill just said that way back when there, before the moratorium, we were harvesting, was it 12-inch fish?
Yep.
12 inches.
So the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission issued their first striped bass management plan in 1981. Up until then, we were fishing on 12-inch fish, and we went to 14 after that as part of that plan. We also finally stopped the commercial fishery on the spawning grounds in the spring pursuant to that plan, and other states did other things pursuant to that plan, but really it was still voluntary for the states at that time. That is an important thing to keep in mind, and the implementation of the plan was pretty spotty up and down the coast. Not to mention the fact that the science was nowhere near where it is today, and the plan, looking back on it, was insufficient really to turn around the decline that we had. This brings up the congressional legislation that was passed in '84, the STUDS Act, the Atlantic Striped Bass Conservation Act, which required all the states from Maine to North Carolina to abide by that plan. That was key. And then ASMFC got together and they put together this recovery plan that protected the 82-year class until 95% of the females spawned at least once, 82 and subsequent year classes. That was the recovery strategy. All the states from Maine to North Carolina had to implement it under a threat of a federal moratorium if they didn't. So that legislation and the recovery plan that stressed rebuilding the spawning stock that ASMFC put together, those were the keys.
That is fascinating. I never heard. So the ASMFC didn't even have the authority to enforce prior to that law.
Not before 1984, no.
Wow, interesting. But of course, today we can look at the ASMFC, and I'm sure Marty can attest to this, as he plays a big role with it, and they can, in fact, enforce up and down the coast. So there's a really big difference from leading up to the moratorium to what we have today. That's pretty massive. One thing we haven't talked about really is the different impacts of recreational versus commercial fishing, which I don't want to turn this into a commercial versus rec thing, because again, I'm going to go back to one of the things I said earlier. We all want a bigger population of rockfish and more access to it. This really shouldn't be so much of an us versus them thing, which it often devolves into. But what I'm wondering is, was it 12 inches for recreational and commercial? Were commercial guys, you mentioned they were actually gill netting on the spawning grounds?
That they were, but that was for the bigger fish in the spring. Yeah. But yeah, during the winter fishery, when they were fishing on the resident stock, those that are here year round, those are the younger fish. They were fishing on 12-inch fish. Yeah.
Well, they did fish on 12-inch fish on the spawning grounds. But what happened over time was that the fishery began, there was what was called an oversized law. You couldn't harvest a fish. I think it was bigger than 15 pounds. But a lot of the harvest of fish in the 60s into the 70s was actually still fishing on males, the 12-inch fish. But as striped bass, well, basically those big fish are very valuable up in the New York market, and the guys began to orient towards that. They increased the twine strength of their nets, and then there was quite an illegal fishery as well. So originally the bulk of the harvest, this goes back to a report from 1967 by a guy named Ed Hollis, and all his biologists that kind of described that fishery. It was oriented. It was an easy time to catch those fish. It glutted the market. In a lot of cases, the price was low, but everybody did it. So, but it did switch more and more to these bigger fish on the spawning grounds.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned the illegal harvest, which of course is sort of an unknown out there that none of us probably have a really good handle on. But Marty, you're hip deep in this with PRFC. You got to be. How big a fear is there of an illegal harvest? Is it the same as back then, or are you more confident today that the rules are followed?
Are you referring, Lenny, strictly to the commercial fishery, or?
What great
Well, I
point,
mean,
Marty. I guess naturally as a gut reaction, I was thinking of commercial, but but there is a recreational illegal harvest as well, I suppose. Please address both.
well, I mean, I think the quick answer would be on the commercial side of things, and most folks know the accountability measures are not perfect, but by any means, but they're pretty stringent compared to the management of other fisheries. There's a tag that's given out in our jurisdiction. We limit the number of tags, so there's only so many that can be distributed. Some states, I think Maryland still uses commercial check stations. Everybody does it a little bit differently, but they're on a hard quota with the tags. They're on a slot limit. They're on mesh size. Well, in the gillnet fishery, at least, they're on mesh sizes to select for specific sizes that are within that slot limit. So I think that the accountability measures that is what we're really talking about. I think they're pretty strong. Are they completely bulletproof? We found out back, I guess it was like in 2006, 7, 8, down on the Potomac, there was a big problem, and there was a federal intervention down there with a sting operation. And in my time at DNR, there was one down at Hooper's Island. So they happen. There were the illegal gill nets that occurred. I think you all recall. I can't remember exactly when that was, but I think 14, 15 or so off Tillman. I mean, things like this do happen. Fortunately, the coordination with law enforcement, I think, has gotten a lot better. So, it does happen, but I think the opportunity for it has been greatly restricted by working with enforcement and our accountability measures. On the rec side, I think it's a matter of just folks that don't want to pay attention to the speed limits, right? We have folks that we know that will fish in areas that they're not allowed to fish. At times they can't fish, keeping fish undersized. We see it on all of our jurisdictional, citation blotters that come across. Some of that can be addressed for people that just don't know with education, but for the folks that don't know and don't care, that's a different story. So, but the magnitude of the recreational fishery, I think, is a challenge, just because there's so many people fishing and so many fish being caught, if that makes sense.
It does, and that's a great issue to bring up. And I wanted to bring it up because I don't know, Bill, Jim, Marty, I don't know exactly how much insight you'll have into this, but I wonder, I have to wonder, back in the 80s, or I guess really the 70s and 80s, leading up to the moratorium and going into the moratorium, how did the number of anglers on the bay compare? Like, do we even have a handle on that? Is that a toughie?
It's a toughie because I have looked into that in the past, but it strains my memory a little bit too much. There were a couple of creel surveys done. But I think, even though Maryland has a high population, it's not a high proportion of people anymore that fish compared to the old days. But then again, the technology is recreational fishing technology is so advanced compared to what you had then. I mean, fathometers were just, well, actually, yeah, they were kind of just being used. For direction, people had to be able to pick up landmarks to find their fishing spots. Then they went to Loran. GPS just obliterates all that, makes it incredibly easy. Just a lot of different things. But fishing was always a big part of Maryland's heritage. So, and the people that fished, they weren't catch and release fishermen. They harvested a lot of fish. It's not unusual to see pictures of somebody coming back in a trip with a wheelbarrow full, or something like that. So it was just a very different world, a very much more pristine habitat in ways. So I would guess the relative impact of the recreational fishing may not have been quite as high, but I wouldn't discount it as being, some small shadow of what we got now.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So, Lenny, can I comment on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I agree with Jim. Basically, I grew up fishing for rock in the bay in the 60s, and my dad and I would bring 100 fish home on every now and then. Not unusual to do that. These are 12-inch fish. And it wasn't unusual for that to happen. Lots of people did it. So we were part of the problem, essentially. We weren't overfishing the spawning stock then collectively. I don't think that happened later, but we were doing what's called growth overfishing. We were catching so many fish collectively that the average size of the fish went down. And that's kind of a prelude to recruitment overfishing, the kind that actually reduces the spawning stock down below a threshold level. But the key lesson there, though, as far as the impact of the recreational fishery, in my opinion, is how good is the fishing? When it's good, when there are a lot of fish out there, lots of people go fishing. That's the way it was in the 60s. When it's bad and there aren't many fish, people do something else. And that's the way it was in the 70s. Those that stayed underwater fished for bluefish. I was one of them. But the same lesson applies now. And so the impact of the recreational fishery, you have to factor that in, can fluctuate quite a bit with the quality of the fishing that's available to them.
That's interesting. I've noticed, not that this is a little off topic, but I've noticed that if you look at the license numbers from like pre-recession, pre-08 to today, they're really not very different. And there was a little bit of a decline in recreational after the recession hit, and it's taken until now to really come back. Now that's a good, 2008 was, a lot of years afterwards, obviously. But I think you're right. Those numbers really do swing quite a bit. That's interesting. I'm going to turn this over to you guys to see if you have any questions to ask each other. I'm curious if this conversation has generated any questions in your minds. What do you think? Do you have a question for the rest of the panel? Marty, please.
I do, because I'm going to take deference out of being the young guy here. So I'll ask both Bill and Jim to take turns on this one. So based on what we learned from going into the moratorium, and as we've noted on this call, the decline that we're seeing now, and it is a real decline, it's not the same. It's not comparable to that late 70s, early 80s timeframe. But we were in a situation that nobody had ever experienced. You both lived it and went through it. We're involved with, the analyses of the data at a high level with Jim, and Bill, you were involved in the policy development that was occurring with the leadership at DNR in your role. So I guess my question would be, what did we learn from that time period that would be valuable for the future discussion that's going to occur here, I guess, with this series further out in the year?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. I think there are a lot of lessons from back then. And I'll put in a plug for that article I wrote, Lenny. I don't know if you have a reference to it somewhere, but I wrote a commentary in the Bay Journal in 1994 about lessons of striped bass that you can look up on their archives if you care to. But one of the big lessons, in my opinion, Marty, is that you have to have range-wide management. You have to have coordinated conservation, controls on the amount of fish you're catching throughout the range of a given population, or it's not going to be effective. Maryland could have done a moratorium, and if the other states within the range up to Maine did not take comparable measures, we would not have seen the recovery. That's one thing. Range-wide management's key. Another one is science-based management. That's our best tool. Science is our best tool for establishing how many you can take. And that's what I'm going to just abbreviate as the conservation step of management, determining how many fish you can take. And then the third thing I would say is you have to be sure to separate that function of management, conservation, from the function of management that determines who gets to take them. And that's allocation. So let's use science to determine how many you can take over here. and then let's use social, economic, stakeholder input, whatever, over here to divvy up the pie. You know, back historically, when we had the decline, and other fisheries tell the same story, when politics really drove management, when they came into a controversy, they just pretended like the pie was bigger. You know, they mixed up conservation and allocation, and trying to satisfy all the stakeholder groups basically compromised conservation, and that led to declines. So keeping conservation and allocation separate is the third lesson from my standpoint.
Okay, my turn, I guess. Okay, so from my standpoint, the moratorium was really poor management, but it worked. We pushed the population right to the edge, and then it was a Hail Mary. We stopped fishing, and in most people's minds, that worked. But this isn't a good way to manage a fishery. And really, as Bill said, it's this strengthened interstate management, this coordination among the states, that we learned that, managing fishing can work, and it can work very well at times, but it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. I do have my issues with interstate management now, but it works far better than what existed before. And really, those lessons from interstate management have transferred to stronger management of fisheries that the state's responsible for. That whole philosophy came, transferred, and our management generally is much better than it was in the past. But the recovery, this stuff came with a kind of a myopic downside. I mean, one thing we didn't pay attention to, and Bill mentioned it earlier, was we weren't paying attention to whether the forage was adequate to support a recovery, and also the potential for collateral issues such as predation on weak fish, the river herring and Atlantic salmon, really for quite a time. And it's still kind of a quandary, these kinds of trade-offs you have to make in this kind of multi-species ecological world. And the other thing we really didn't learn to pay much stronger attention to, at least as fisheries managers, is habitat and how the factors and measures other than managing fishing mortality could really potentially or really did contribute to recovery. And we're talking big scale measures like the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts, conservation agriculture and the Chesapeake Bay program. Fisheries are managed kind of as if these things didn't exist, but you can find positive influence. And for one example, and I won't go on and on, but the Clean Water Act cleaned up the Delaware River. And we actually added a spawning area to the coastal population. It's not just the Chesapeake, but we added another, basically some place that was producing zero went to, producing some amount of fish for the coastal fishery. So, these are things that we kind of really, I think it's a view we've neglected simply in the euphoria of we cut back fishing, everything shot up. But there's actually a very strong argument to be made for improvements in habitat that enhance the productivity, and you got sort of a 1-2 punch of really managing your spawning fish better and also having a boost in productivity.
Well, let me take that over to Bill for a question about conversation. Bill, in the lead up to the moratorium and during the moratorium, what was water quality like? I mean, I remember what I saw looking over the side of the boat, but I sure don't remember things like, the Eyes on the Bay site that I could check on different areas, and we didn't hear as much about a dead zone. What was water quality like?
Well, it was compromised. I mean, it was a problem back in the 70s, into the 80s, and it really got worse for a period of time until we started turning things around in recent decades. But the SAV had declined dramatically in the 70s. It kind of peaked in the 60s, but in recent history. It had declined quite a bit in the 70s, and of course, oysters are already down to a few percent of their historic level. So oyster reefs were way down and were flattened, frankly, by 100 plus years of harvest. So oyster reefs, grass beds, two very key habitats for striped bass. And to Jim's point, really on that, striped bass don't live in a vacuum. They don't live in a silo. You can't just say, I want to have, a million striped bass and not think about the repercussions for the rest of the food web and the habitat that would be needed to sustain those fish. So we really have to think as ecologists moving forward. Water quality, I would defer to some of my previous colleagues on the 70s for that, but it was getting so bad that it led to a 7-year Chesapeake-based study by EPA, the results of which came out in the early 80s and drove the whole Chesapeake Bay recovery program and continues to this day, frankly, all that work. That we do have a big dead zone in the bay that's a result of nutrient pollution. The effects on fish like striped bass have been documented because they need that cooler, deeper water in the summer, but they can't use it because there's no oxygen there because of the dead zone. So that work is going on a parallel track to the fisheries work, but it's every bit as important. I did mention earlier that the watermen in the 70s were saying pollution was the problem in the decline of striped bass. Well, pollution was a big problem. We still had a lot of point source pollution, but that was the low-hanging fruit, and that was taken care of early on in the Bay program. And by that, I'm talking about pipes from industry or sewage treatment plants, what have you, directly emitting pollutants right into the Bay or its tributaries. So a lot of that's been dealt with, and the non-point source stuff, farm runoff, stormwater, those things are much harder to deal with, but we're making progress on them too. But the watermen weren't wrong with respect to pollution. Pollution was a problem, is a problem. It had been getting worse for decades up until the 70s. But the decline that happened in the 70s was fast. Remember, we had a record spawn of stripers in 1970, as Jim mentioned. And then it flattened out to near nothing into the 70s and early 80s. That didn't happen. We did not have that severe of an onset of pollution during that period that could account for that. So it really was the harvest pressure superimposed on the backdrop of a compromised habitat that really led to that decline. Now, I do need to point out one finer point there that Jim alluded to earlier, and that is when stripers and other anadromous or semi-anadromous species spawn, those are the ones that go upstream to spawn, they're spawning in much smaller waters and low salinity or fresh water, both of which are much more susceptible to pollutants, much easier to be damaged by human activity. Similarly, as Jim also alluded, weather in the spring can alter temperature, flow, salinity pretty dramatically from year to year, and can also affect the survival of those eggs and larvae that are produced in the spawning activity. Remember, those are the sensitive life cycle stages, the ones that really can be affected most by water quality, the eggs, the larvae, the fingerlings. So you always want to look for when and where a given fish stock goes through those stages. And that's where you want to be really careful about your water quality and habitat.
It's interesting you mentioned those stages because, of course, there's a lot of angst today over invasive species, i.e. blue cats. Are they eating the baby rockfish before they have a chance to grow up? It makes me wonder, was that a worry back then? But I guess it wouldn't have been blue cats, but there must have been other species.
I did a 10-year survey of striped bass early life stages in the Choptank River from 1980 to about 1990. We did look for predators. Actually, there wasn't much sign of it. The one fish species, ironically, that is a forage species for striped bass, we did find some larvae in them, was bay anchovy. But
They're getting their revenge.
yeah, well, it wasn't a lot of them, but really, I mean, I don't wholly disagree or agree with Bill. Being real specific, the issues we had in the 70s and 80s were probably very specific to the spawning grounds, and these are kind of the interface of fresh tidal to very low salinity water, and at least in some of the spawning tributaries. Fish and Wildlife Service did some wonderful work back then on toxicity, and there was a pretty good signal that for some places like the Nanticoke and Choptank in particular, possibly the Potomac, that water conditions, the acidity and lack of buffering was making what we had was contributing to metals toxicity. We had high levels of heavy metals, and these could have been both the acidity and the lack of buffering, and the metals were certainly symptoms around the East Coast of acid rain. That was one thing. But agriculture had gone through some big changes, and some things like the inorganic fertilizers and some of the pesticides have heavy metals associated with them. Been a sea change in how agriculture has been done in the both really across the country, but in particular in the Chesapeake Bay. This conservation agriculture really it's oriented towards nutrients, and when people think of habitat problems, they only think in terms of what I call the holy trinity, which is phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment. But the measures used to control those in agriculture would have also really helped reduce erosion, and probably they've been shown scientifically to help reduce toxicity. So, on this backdrop of really aggressive fisheries management, we've also had fairly aggressive habitat management measures, and those habitat measures are really hard to evaluate. But
Now, Zach popped up that question there real quick about leaded gas and the effect that could have had. I'm trying to remember in my head when they even switched.
Yeah, it would have been somewhere in the 70s or 70s. Switched.
Oh, wait a minute. We have a guest star questioner here, people. John Page Williams. Oh my God, John Page. Hello. It is good to see your name. And he's asked, let's see, what's he saying here? Okay. In the last 40 years, the human population of the Chesapeake watershed has grown from 12 million to 18 million. That's a big jump. And a lot more of the watershed is now paved in one way or another. How much of those changes affected our rockfish? Who wants to take on that one?
We've been actually started studying that about 2014. We've looked at some of the watersheds like the Patuxent and Wicomico on the eastern shore that have fairly heavy development pressure compared to the others. And unlike for some other species like herring that spawn in small streams and so on, there's not a real big signal for striped bass yet. But yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that my program has worked on for almost 2 decades, and actually we go back further, is the effect of development on fisheries. And almost any fisherman can tell you, if you build a subdivision on my water, on my stream or by my lake or something, fishing is going to suffer.
The water turns brown.
It's,
I've seen that happen outside my window.
There are just a host of problems that arise with development. And
So-
it's not any just one. So there we go. I'll leave there.
So if I may, Lenny, to John Page's point, he was referencing the amount of the watershed that's been paved over. That is essential to the health of the estuary, because the watershed is sending fresh water down, which mixes with seawater, and that gives you your estuary. But what all the organisms, the ecosystem, the populations, rockfish or what have you in the bay have evolved to be used to is a certain fluctuation of salinity, a certain range of fresh water coming in, mostly in the spring, seawater mixing and so forth. And so they'll adapt to a certain range of salinity. When you put so much impervious surface in a watershed, you impair the functioning of that watershed, because rainfall that comes down is immediately shunted into the nearest stream. Like you said, it turns brown and down into the bay, as opposed to so much of it filtering into the ground to the groundwater, which takes a lot longer to get to the bay. And during a drought, it will be there to replenish your streams. Your streams won't go dry because there's no groundwater. So we're effectively turning the watershed from a filter into a funnel. That's the analogy that's often used. So that fresh water is funneled down to the bay much more quickly than it would normally be. And what that does is it alters that salinity range, that zonation of salinity in the bay that all these organisms have evolved to be used to. So all of the life cycles that are keyed on salinity go upstream, spawn at the freshwater saltwater interface like stripers or what have you. These dynamics are shifting, and how all the organisms adapt to it is really the million-dollar question. I don't know if Jim's programs are able to pick up signals that would be able to relate it to a specific species like rockfish or not, but clearly the entire biosphere, if you will, in the bay is affected by it, is stressed by it at the very least, but certainly has to adapt to the different salinity zones and the frequency of shifts and extremity of shifts in salinity that result from that turning of the watershed into a filter into a funnel instead of a filter.
I remember being a kid and seeing the model of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and they put a little drop of food color on the mountain and on the parking lot and then spray with water. And you could see how if it didn't soak in, it just all ran right into the bay. Remember those models? Where are those models today? I don't know. Well, Marty, you had held up two fingers. I wonder if you had a second question, or should we move on here?
No, I was just going to add to what Jim and Bill said about the anthropogenic impacts, all the humans and the development, what's occurred. Your future panel is going to have quite their hands full when you add climate impacts to that discussion, right? So, I know the one thing that comes up with folks in our field in fisheries is the warming bay temperatures, right? Impact on, just the existential part of the life cycle for all of our fish species, including striped bass, but also in that spawning period, the food sources that they rely on, the temperature-induced phytoplankton blooms and the zooplankton blooms that follow those, and the timing of those blooms related to the timing of the striped bass spawning. This is already a complex situation, to management. And I love Jim's comments on how he characterized spawning and the strategy that striped bass employ. Boy, it got a whole lot. The odds got a whole lot higher now with the climate impacts that we're all facing. And fortunately, the fishermen see this. They're out on the water all the time. They see the range expansion. They see the behavior in the fish because they're following them day to day. So luckily, we're all on the same page with that. But what we really need to do is adapt. It's going to be a constant and consistent pathway toward adaptation in the future. So your future panel has got their work cut out for them.
Man, you're not kidding. The whole climate change thing just throws a monkey wrench into everything, every conversation about it. And yeah, it's interesting. Well, I want to, Zach, if we got any more viewer questions, pop them on up there. I want to give you guys the opportunity to ask each other any other questions you may have. I got more down here, but I want to, let other folks get in their digs. Nope,
Hey, Lenny, I'm going to go ahead and because this is too good of an opportunity with Bill and Jim. But one observation I made, it's a good lens for me. Obviously, Jim and Bill were there before the moratorium. I was still in school and just started working in '85 when it was implemented. But coming out of the moratorium when the fishery was reopened, it was really fascinating to see a couple of things. I'll characterize one phenomenon as a slippery slope and the other one as a fire hose. So the slippery slope was the spring trophy fishery. As Bill and Jim, I think both alluded to at times during the conversation, for decades, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, I guess, all the way up to 1980, Maryland was managing on almost kind of like a slot limit. As Jim mentioned, for a long time, you had like a 15-pound maximum. And then, as Bill mentioned, it was like a 10 or 12-inch minimum. So we were harvesting these mostly younger fish and protecting the older fish. But then when we reopened the fishery in 1990, I remember sitting in one of our meetings, and that's where I got to start working with a lot of the fishery groups, Sport Fish Advisory Committee, Tidal Fish, et cetera. And there was a push to open that spring fishery, which happened in '91. But that first spring trophy fishery opened up on May 11th with a 36-inch minimum size, I believe. And it was a one fish per person per year, per season, with a permit, a tag that you had to have. Very, very conservative, right? And the request, the ask for that fishery was, we want folks to have a chance to have an experience to catch a really big fish. So the slippery slope I'm describing was a situation where we went from that ask of a chance to catch a big fish to a situation like 04, 05, when everybody expected to catch a big fish. It wasn't like, oh, I want to go out and maybe I'll get one. It's so good, I expect to catch a big fish, right? So, if you charter a boat, the poor charter captains, I felt bad for them because everybody didn't get their fish. They failed almost in 04, 05. It was amazing to me to see that happen over that span of time. So the question will be in a second is, what are your thoughts on that? What can we take away from that? Or do you agree that maybe we should have done things differently, we should have been more precautious? But I also want to throw out the fire hose component. So when the fish would mass in certain areas, like recall, I want to say it was probably very late 90s into the early 2000s, when the fish were assimilating at the Capes in large numbers. And folks were going down there, and it was an unbelievable fishery. But it was all happening in what they called in MRIP wave one. And that was extremely data poor. We really didn't even know how many fish were being harvested, I think, in wave one, back in, I guess, 01 or 02. But there was no doubt there was a tremendous amount of pressure put on that fishery at that time. And so I guess now I'll throw it back to Jim and Bill to say, what are your thoughts on that? Is that something where maybe we should have tapped the brakes a little bit quicker? Hindsight's always 20/20, right?
Well, go ahead, Jim.
I would just say my answer is more of an emotional one, maybe. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but the trophy fishery really didn't exist until maybe the late 60s or 70s. They weren't allowed to harvest big fish until like somewhere in June. And then it was the opportunity to catch a trophy fish, fish of a big fish. And I don't know. I felt biologically dead fish are dead fish, and it doesn't matter. But, it was kind of almost a lack of respect for the fish. you know, I don't know. I guess because I catch a lot of the smaller ones, and these big fish are just seem very special. So it just bothered me that we weren't respecting those traditions. So I think from the start, I mean, we dropped the size limit to 28 inches, as well. So it was almost a meat fishery. But then again, it's very popular, and the expectation probably was that this can go on forever. And I guess my only point is, as fisheries managers, and I think this was something Sherman Baynard used to always say, that we manage expectations as much as we manage fish. So people's expectations got extremely unrealistic, and the management system wasn't willing to tell them, no. We were very permissive parents. And, so how much of an effect did it have? I mean, we still have pretty good spawning stock. I don't, obviously it has an effect when you take spawners out, but the same fish that we harvest, if we are also harvested all summer up the coast at a big size. So it's just a matter of who gets to kill them and how many can you allow? So that's not a very good answer, but that's my answer.
Well, my take on it, if you will, is when we came out of the moratorium, reopening a spring trophy fishery was not part of the plan. It was added in the first couple of years. The recreational angler started fishing again on October 1st, 1990. And Marty, I don't know if you said it was 91, in the spring of 91. I would have said it was maybe a year or two later, but the department had convened something called the Striped Bass Advisory Board to 10 people, different stakeholder groups represented, to advise them on what the nature of the fishery would be with the reopening. And I was on that. And I can tell you that it was quite controversial to restart a spring trophy fishery. There were a lot of emotions, like Jim was alluding to, certainly. But obviously a bigger fish biologically is valuable for the exponentially more eggs they can produce, depending on size. But it was a charter fishery that really pushed hard to get the spring trophy fishery for the economic benefits that they would accrue. Now, you were right, I think, when you said, was it May 15th, you said when it started? When we first came in, agreed to start a spring trophy fishery, it was May 15th. I think it was only water south of Bloody Point, and one fish per year, like you said, high minimum size. And then for the several years after that, politically, I'll just say that, generally speaking, we chipped away at that. We chipped away at the minimum size, making it smaller. We chipped away at the area you could fish, extending it further up the bay. And we chipped away at the date you could start. And it ended up going to May 1st and eventually to, what was it? At one point, the third Saturday in April, I think, was the earliest it got. And the problem with that, from a biological standpoint, if you try and boil it down to that, notwithstanding all of the respect of the stock that Jim was talking about, is that the earlier you go and the further up the bay you go, the more you're going to encounter fish that have not spawned yet. And I think that's the one metric we know we can wrap our arms around, is if you're going to have a spring trophy fishery, at least try and structure it using those different guidelines in a way that's going to minimize or eliminate taking any fish that have not gotten up the bay or up the tributaries to spawn. Have it only be on fish post-spawn that are heading out of the bay. I think that's something that we can try and guide it by. But it was very controversial, remains very controversial. I would agree with that.
So you brought out a couple really interesting points right there. And I'm just going to say, you guys may already know this, but I think there are going to be a lot of folks out there who are very surprised to hear that way back when, prior to the crash, before the moratorium, the big fish were left alone. Like that's a fascinating point that many people probably don't realize. And it leads me to another question I want to ask real quick. I think we're running shy on time and we got viewer questions and I don't want to interfere, but I just got to ask you real quick because actually I've always wondered this. And you talk about how the initial fishery opened up in October, right? So it was resident fish. It was not migratory fish.
Right.
I remember that opening. That was like a massive event in my family. And the fish that we caught in the fall for that year and for a good 2 or 3 years following that were all 30-inch plus fish. You were not fishing for 22-inch fish in the fall. Today, that 32 4-inch fish in the fall is a unicorn, right? There are a few out there, but there aren't many. Why is that? This is like a separate, it's almost like a subsection of the fishery, right? When we start talking about our resident fish versus our migratory fish. But it seems to me that the resident fish have their own, it's like its own topic somehow. What happened to the big resident fish?
Basically, those big resident fish were the product of modest year classes, very well protected, with a lot of forage, and they weren't being pressured by other big year classes. They weren't competing with their brothers and sisters. So that was just for a striped bass that was living then, they were in hog heaven. They had lots to eat. They didn't have much competition, and they could grow fast. And basically, we caught them up. And but one of the things that happened, among many things that happened as the population really grew by about 1997, there were indications that the natural mortality rate went up quite a bit. Fish condition was poor. Mycobacteriosis broke out. We had lesions. These are signs of the kinds of things that regulate high populations. In addition to the habitat issues like temperature and DO and things like that, it's just we had a really high population, and we were managing for sizes of fish that never had been in, so at least since probably, I don't know, however long white people started fishing for striped bass. Probably if you looked at pound net records from the 1960s, an 18-inch fish was incredibly rare. You hardly ever saw one. That was our minimum size limit. And we're growing, so there's a lot to be said for thinking about the carrying capacity.
So are we talking about the Petri dish where you put in a little bit and it grows?
Yeah, the Lac Voltaire experiment with the whatever the little things are, and you count them and you watch them go up and then die. And it's just basic basic ecology.
So we may have seen the best of it.
Yes.
I mean, a unique set of circumstances.
Right.
Okay. Now we had a couple questions from viewers that popped up real quick and then disappeared. Zach, I didn't have time to see them. I don't know if they were questions we wanted to get to the panel here. We have we're running real short on time. But if we got time to bring them back up and they're good questions, by all means, let's bring them back up. So Matthew's asking, it seems like we should get rid of trophy season altogether. Harvesting fish full of eggs pre-spawn doesn't seem very good for the population. Well, I would say that's a pretty straightforward assertion. Does anybody want to?
We are basically, the way management works for striped bass, we're letting those fish spawn multiple times before they die. Not their, let's say, a full lifetime, like they never fished, but that they're getting a lot of opportunities they wouldn't have had maybe earlier. And also the fish that trophy fish we don't fish for here are the bread and butter of the fisheries up north. So we don't have to necessarily fish them hard here, but management is very conservative. That's the shortest answer I can give you on that.
I like conservative management. Let's keep it where we need it for the fish. We are out of time. Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much. I want to mention a couple things before we close this out. The first is Bill mentioned an article he wrote on the, I guess you stop me if I'm wrong, Bill, but it sounds more or less like the applicability of what we learned in the moratorium as it applies to other fisheries. Is that
right?
Okay? So
right.
We have set up a page at fishtalkmag.com. If you go to fishtalkmag.com, there's a search box in the upper right. Simply type in Chesapeake Perspective. You'll find what's basically a data dump. Oh, thank you, Zach. You'll find what's basically a data dump from everything we've talked about. We've got some additional information in there. Like I say, just punch in Chesapeake Perspective, press go. You'll find that page in no time. Let's see, gentlemen, thank you so much for participating. We really appreciate it. I want to extend a special thanks to Dave Sikorsky and Chris Dollar for coming up with a whole concept of doing the Chesapeake Perspective series, and then for pushing until it came to fruition. I want to thank Zach Ditmars, our Fish Talks kayak fishing Sharpie and tech guru, for hiding behind the curtain and pulling all of those levers. We really appreciate it, Zach. And don't forget, everybody, tonight is episode 1 out of 3. We'll be back on Thursday, July 14th, to address the next critical item on the agenda. And we will then be talking about the current state of the fishery, habitat, and forage, which we touched on a little bit the history of today, but we'll get a lot more into habitat, forage, and all that good stuff. Now, that's a long way off, and it's easy to forget the date between now and then. So, folks, if you haven't already, sign up to get the updates via email. We'll let you know when it's coming. Again, you can go to the Chesapeake Perspectives page. I think Zach might have a link for that. He can pop up there real quick. If not, oh, there it is. You got it up again. All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Lenny. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for the opportunity.